20 hours from Singapore to O'Hare International with a stopover in Taipei, a business-class flight that was little better than a cattle car called economy, and even on my birthday, hardly alarmed me. Returning to Chicago for a brutal meeting with the head of our international stocks and shares trading desk didn't bother me much either. Trying to anticipate what would happen back home did, though. We landed a little after 8:30 a.m. and I caught a shuttle to the nearby Chicago Sheraton Suites Hotel. I had booked the room the night before, so it was available immediately. I dropped my stuff, showered, and headed to the gym. I worked out with weights for 30 minutes, ran on the treadmill for another 30, and then went to shower. This time I stood under the jets for almost 15 minutes before turning off the hot water and dousing myself with cold water until I was almost frozen. Anyone will tell you that April in Chicago can't be called warm, but I endured until my teeth were chattering, then 5 minutes of hot water to warm me up, and I was as close to waking up as I could possibly be. I headed to the restaurant for the American breakfast I'd missed so much for the past 4 months. Between pancakes, scrambled eggs, bacon, and sausage drenched in maple syrup, I drank 4 cups of coffee and headed to J.P. Morgan on Dearborn Avenue, where my appointment was set for 10:30. I took the elevator to the 8th floor, where the private banking suites were located, and walked through the lobby, showing my ID. From there, I was escorted to one of the small conference rooms and asked to wait. So that's how they wanted to play it out. There were 2 cameras covering opposite corners of the room, and I'm sure they were watching me. I tossed my leather briefcase and laptop onto the table, ignoring the polished wood, and walked over to the window. I stood there staring out at the street without moving. They left me there for more than 17 minutes. I know because I reached 1020 Mississippi. In all that time, I didn't move an inch. During my many trips to the Far East and Southeast Asia, I learned a few things. One of them was face. Not to be afraid or show weakness no matter what. Joe Rutledge, Vice President of International Stock and Commodities Traders, walked in, followed by Samuel Young, our corporate lawyer. If it had been just Joe, the meeting would have turned into a brainstorming session on fixing the problem and plugging the bleeding. If it had been Samuel alone, it would have been about how to cover the bank's ass in legal terms. But it was the 2 of them, so someone was going to get fired, and that someone was me. Adam. It wasn't without a handshake. He gestured to a seat and they decided to sit across from me. The battle line was drawn. What the hell happened in Singapore? It wasn't really a question. We sent you there to provide stability for the young ones, and instead, you approved the purchase of $300 million worth of stock in a brand new company listed on the Singapore Stock Exchange with no data other than they claim it's a good idea. Yes. Yes to what? Yes. His face turned from ruddy to purple, and a vein protruded on his forehead. Perhaps you'd care to elaborate? Look, Joe, it's all in my report. The CEO prospect was top-notch. They dotted all the I's and dot all the T's. The management team from top to bottom is made up of experts in the field with nearly 200 years of experience. In addition, the project itself is 50 years in the making, and those numbers have been confirmed by Deloitte and KPMG. I sighed. The oceans have been fished dry, and their aquaculture project is one of the most technologically advanced on the planet and backed by real know-how and capabilities. Then why is their share price falling? He exclaimed. They went public at $17 a share, and now they're trading at $9.55. He tapped his finger on the table. And what did you do? You went out and bought more. Yes, because there will be a rebound, and if the price reaches 25, as my team and I are forecasting, we'll have half at 17 and half at 9.55. That's a potential profit of $267 million. That's almost 90% profit. He didn't understand the whole picture. Joe, we own 25% of all shares. We are the single largest shareholder. A company that's failing, he shouted, sputtering with saliva. That's because the Chinese and, to a lesser extent, the Thais and Vietnamese are short-selling to either sink the company because it's in direct competition with their own fisheries and threatens their near monopolies in Southeast Asia, or to buy it for next to nothing and expand their position in the international fish trade. I prodded him across the table. We need to have the courage to stand our ground. It's just a failure. He shook his head. This isn't the crazy 80s and 90s. We need to trade on confidence and maintain a positive risk ratio. It's all in my report. I pointed it out again. Your report is nothing more than 50 pages of wishful thinking, he accused me. Anyway, it's not just my decision now. The council has approved my recommendation and you're out. And so it was Samuel's turn to let me off the hook. The offer was 3 months' salary and almost 30 days of accrued vacation. effectively giving me almost 5 months of pay. In addition, they would cash in my stock options and pay the difference between the issue price and the current price. All in all, I would walk away with almost $800,000, but with a ruined reputation and zero prospects for future employment, other than at McDonald's or KFC. By 2 o'clock, I had signed all the necessary forms, rolled my 17-year-old 401k into an IRA, turned in all company materials, including my laptop, and was escorted out. I stood on the sidewalk with an empty satchel over my shoulder and a strange feeling in my head like I had a brain aneurysm. I hurried to catch a cab to get back to the hotel, and my imagination vividly pictured me dying in the street with strangers pointing and staring at me. Once in my room, I grabbed a whiskey mini from the bar, mixed it with 7-Up, and poured it over ice. Blasphemy. I know. I sat down to contemplate my options. I was 42. I was too young to retire, but was I too old to start over? There was only one option left, and it seemed like a gamble, but on the other hand, would I have the courage or not? I decided that if I didn't have the courage, how could I expect others to have it? So I went shopping. An hour later, I returned with a brand new laptop that had Windows 11 installed and was ready to play. I downloaded the programs needed to track purchases and sales and got to work. I plugged in a flash drive with all my Singapore transactions, which I had thoughtfully left in my hotel room and away from my employer, and was ready to go. I checked our savings account. It had $50,000 in it. I had $250,000 each in my investment accounts, but it required 24 hours notice. I did so, then sold some blue chip stocks I owned and calculated that with my salary and option payments, I would hopefully have over $1,200,000. The money was due in the next 2 days, and I transferred almost the entire amount into an offshore trading account called Blue Sky International. By the time I finished, it was already 9 o'clock. I ordered a hamburger and a beer from room service and pulled out my phone. It had been off for over 36 hours. That was the longest it had been off in a long time. I considered turning it on, but I was mentally exhausted and incapable of dealing with all that was ahead of me, so I gave it up and instead lay on my bed watching the news. I switched to another channel to see how the world markets were doing, but there was almost nothing I wanted to know about. Whiskey, beer, hamburger, whiskey. Eventually, the jet lag caught up with me and I passed out. The next morning, I had a very early breakfast as my internal clock was still going off. I drank my coffee and turned on my phone. It burst with messages. "Help, Dad, Mom is having a breakdown." It was from Dean and Katie. The message was longer, but the gist of it was this. "What's going on with Jean?" From my dad. "Happy birthday, and why aren't you answering your phone?" From Jean's parents. "Happy birthday, Dad." From Dean and Kathy. "Happy birthday and good luck, Adam." From Team Singapore. "Happy birthday, son." From Dad. "Happy birthday, little brother." From my sister Georgia. More calls followed from Dean, who said Mom was sad and crying but had already calmed down. There were no calls from Jean. No birthday greetings, no explanation as to why everyone thought she was acting weird. It was like I didn't exist. I caught the 8:30 flight to Springfield, called home, and found myself in a hot mess. The kids had left their games, soda cans, and plates all over the living room. The floors looked like our vacuum cleaner was broken. The kitchen was even worse. The sink was clogged with unwashed plates. The dishwasher was overflowing. The trash can was overflowing. I took things to the laundry room, where unwashed clothes lay unwashed for what seemed like weeks. I separated the white and light from the dark and began the process. Once back in, I began to put things in order from the living room to the kitchen. There were 2 empty wine bottles and stemmed glasses in the living room. Both had lipstick marks of different colors on them. Our bedroom looked like it hadn't been changed in a while. I put on clean sheets, changed the duvet cover, and ventilated the room. The children's rooms were indeed cleaner. Dirty, but cleaner. Being in cleaning mode, I packed, and did the rest. I vacuumed the floors and emptied the trash cans. It was almost 3 hours before I thought I had gotten things done, so I headed to my office to turn on my laptop. The first thing I did was check the Southeast Asia Aquaculture, CA rate. It was down to $9.37. That was almost 2 points down for the day. We'll see what kind of balls I have once my money is in the till and I can enter the market. I called my dad. My mom died 5 years ago of breast cancer. We discussed Jean. He said she had seemed sad and depressed the last 2 weeks. He said she was heartbroken, but for no apparent reason. Strange. I checked our bank transactions, but there's nothing unusual. It just keeps getting weirder and weirder. I checked the messages on our home phone, but nothing unexpected there either. I dried and folded my clothes for a bit, then decided to see what we had for dinner. The short answer was nothing much. I went into the garage and reconnected the battery to my Audi A6. I pressed the start button and the car started the first time. I went to the local supermarket, bought some essentials, and came back with a set of groceries to make Thai green curry and jasmine rice. I boiled the rice in water and coconut milk with a bit of ginger to give it extra flavor. I stir-fried the chicken strips with zucchini, Asian eggplant, chopped lemongrass, fresh minced garlic, a bunch of Asian basil and fresh cilantro leaves with fresh green chilies. I added a can and a half of coconut milk, 2 tablespoons of green curry paste, and the zest and juice of 2 limes. A tablespoon of fish sauce and finally a teaspoon of sugar to balance the sourness, and let boil. I chopped 4 spring onions, fresh coriander and basil leaves to garnish the dish with them, set the table and poured myself a beer. I was halfway there when Jean's car pulled up in the driveway, and the kids, spotting my car in the driveway, ran into the house screaming that Daddy was home. I hugged them both at the same time and kissed them over and over. I told them how much I missed them, even though we Skype a lot. Tears came to my eyes and Katie sobbed in my arms, clinging tightly to me, her whole body shaking. Dean was a little more subdued, as befitted his almost-man status. We stayed like that for a long time. When I looked up, I saw that Jean was looking at us. At me. There was a strange, almost wistful expression in her eyes, and a couple of tears rolled down her cheek. She waited until I stood up, cradling our children in her arms, and pulled me close and kissed me gently on the lips. "Welcome home, Adam." There wasn't much enthusiasm in her words, and her body language indicated some sadness or discomfort. Her eyes didn't linger on me for very long. That smells nice," she sniffed. "What is it?" "It's Thai green curry," exclaimed I. Dean and Katie looked at me incomprehensibly. "I don't know what it is, Dad, but it smells really good." Dean smiled and hugged me again to the nods and kisses of Kathy, who had her arms around my neck with her legs off the ground. "You two go clean up and get ready for dinner," ordered Jean. "Hurry up. You'll have plenty of time with your father afterward." She came in and gave me a gentle hug and a kiss on the cheek. "You look exhausted, Adam." She visually assessed my condition. "How come you're back so soon? I thought you were going to be there for another 8 weeks." "Turns out the bosses didn't like some of my initiatives," I admitted. "I just got fired." She blushed. Then her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Well, it's..." She fumbled for a word. "Unfortunately," she managed to mutter. "We'll see." "How?" "We'll figure something out." "But what about you?" I stared at this almost stranger standing in front of me. I'd been married for 15 years, and she acted more like an acquaintance than my wife. "Are you okay?" I thought her eyes clouded over, but she blinked and squared her shoulders. "It's work." She tried to smile, but it didn't quite work. "The market's down." That wasn't what I'd heard. "There are changes going on at MRE. There's a lot of pressure on everyone." She spread her arms out to the sides to show how huge. At this point, the kids washed up, came down the stairs, and rushed back to me. "We'll talk later." She turned toward the kitchen. We gathered for a meal. I served and arranged each plate, then poured Jean and me a cool California White. Dean insisted on a can of Mountain Dew, and Kathy asked for water. We sat down at the table and ate dinner as a family for the first time in 4 months. I told the kids stories about Singapore, about the lifestyle and some of the activities I was involved in. They were almost exclusively part of team-building exercises and included dragon boat races, indoor golf, ninja tag, and combat archery. It was all a lot of fun. After emptying their plates, Dean and Kathy disappeared together and returned, smiling, holding a wrapped present. "Happy birthday, Dad." Jean's hands flew to her mouth. I kissed my children to the sounds of "Oh my God" emitted by Jean. "I'm so sorry, Adam." I totally forgot. I was about to pounce on her and remind her that I had given her gold diamond earrings for her birthday. But instead, I focused on the kids. I opened my present. It was a Brothers in Arms set. I loved that show and had always said I wanted to have a CD collection. I kissed them again. Their wide smiles matched mine from the pleasure of giving and receiving. "I'll bring you a present tomorrow, Adam." Jean was embarrassed and remorseful. I waved him away. "You don't have to," I said magnanimously. "Being home with my family is all the present I need." Dean and Katie threw themselves into my arms again with cries of, "Love you, Daddy." We sat at the table talking for an hour or more, but eventually they had to go do their homework while Jean and I cleaned up the kitchen. "What's going on with you, John?" "You're not the person I know." She jerked her hand sharply, as if to stop me, and then her shoulders slumped. I don't know, Adam. I guess I'm depressed. You've always traveled so much and for weeks at a time. Last time it was too long. She looked me in the eye. You're not here. We hardly live the same life. Tears streamed down her cheeks. I feel lost. I reached out and wrapped her in a bear hug. She resisted for a while, but then she gave in and let me hold her and sobbed softly. We stayed like that for a while. I wanted more. I wanted to solve the problem. But she wouldn't let me know that she wanted anything more than to be held. She was right, though. Over the past 6 years, since I'd been promoted to supervisor, I'd found myself in the unenviable role of problem instigator for young, inexperienced teams. We discussed it and agreed that we would have to make sacrifices, with the ultimate goal of both of us retiring when I turned 50 and enjoying a life of leisure and travel. She gently pulled away and suggested I spend some time with the kids. I started with Katie, going over her homework, then did the same with Dean. After tucking Katie into bed, I kissed her goodnight and then walked over to Dean. Mom's not okay, Dad, he said with concern. She's crying and hardly doing anything around the house. She even forgot your birthday. He looked back at the door to make sure we weren't being overheard. I think she's having a nervous breakdown. There were tears in his eyes. Please fix it, Dad. I nodded, even though I had no idea what was going on or what to do about it. As I walked down the stairs, I heard her talking quietly on the phone. She heard or saw me and passed out. Who was that? I raised an eyebrow. One of the girls from the office. She ended the conversation. We looked at each other. She didn't back down an inch. Whatever was bothering her, she wasn't going to discuss it, but she looked like she was angry. Angry at me and trying to hide it. I decided it was a much more serious problem, but I could already feel the jet lag kicking in again, and I still had so much to do. It was 9:30 when I went into my office and checked the Singapore Stock Exchange. They were 13 hours ahead and had been trading for 2 hours already. CA was trading at $9.90. The stock was up a little. I went upstairs and waited for Jean to finish in the bathroom. She washed her face, brushed her teeth and hair, and walked into the bedroom wearing an oversized t-shirt, as she often did when she bothered to wear anything. I cleaned myself up, brushed my teeth, rinsed myself off, and climbed into bed. I reached for her and she tensed for a moment, then pressed herself against me. Please, just hold me, she whispered in a thin voice. I hugged her for a very long time. This was not the woman I knew. Something was fundamentally wrong, but what? Had I been away too long? Was the separation too hard? But she never said anything, not once. Had she fallen out of love with me? Fallen in love with someone else? Had an affair? And then I had a terrible thought. What if she's sick? What if it's a terrible disease and she doesn't know how to tell me? All these thoughts swirled without end. But finally, the jet lag and all the high emotions of the last 2 days took their toll, and I fell into a heavy sleep. I had dreams in which I chased a nameless and unknown shadow but couldn't catch it. I woke up at 4:30 still feeling tired and sick. I decided to go for a run and promised myself to buy melatonin pills from the pharmacy to bring my circadian rhythms back to center time. I was on the road for about an hour, and when I returned, I found Jean gone, carrying a short note asking me to feed the kids breakfast and drive them to school. It was still early, so I went to check my bank account. The money from JP Morgan had cleared, and I transferred it to my offshore account. I checked the CA shares, and not only had they lost their previous gains, but they were trading at $8.99. They weren't exactly in free fall, but on an escalator leading downward. I was faced with a choice. Fix my marriage or fix my financial future? Is it possible to do both? I spent as much time as I could with Dean and Kathy and asked them some general questions about what they were doing in the months I was gone. The answer was that it was nothing much, except for some corporate activities with my mom's boss, Anthony Miller. They played miniature golf, went to the movies, and out to dinner. Kathy didn't notice anything, but Dean must have noticed my face and jumped up. He was always with his daughter, Evelyn, Dad. He defended himself. She always said Mom was such a big part of the company, like we were all one big happy family. Katie nodded in agreement. Yeah, Aunt Evelyn was always with us, she agreed. I smiled at them all and told them I was glad they hadn't stayed home and enjoyed life while I was gone. But now I was back, and summer was on the horizon, and I wanted us to go on vacation and make the best of it. They nodded approvingly, and I hugged and kissed them again. I drove them to school and called a few friends to make arrangements to meet up for the morning. Then I called George Tallis, my old mentor. He was my manager when I first came to the trading floor, and he taught me many unseen trends that no computer program or application will teach you. Everything is driven by greed and fear, he told me over and over again. We talked for a while. He still lived in Chicago and was a registered broker running a small company for a few old clients. We discussed my accreditation. I was registered with the SEC and was a member of FINRA, as well as registered with the Illinois Securities Authority and had signed an AML, anti-money laundering compliance document. We agreed that I would send him an electronic copy of the SEAA prospectus and discuss it later that day. I stopped by the HHS community pharmacy located across the street from St. John's Hospital. It was convenient on the way to my first appointment of the day. I was leaving the pharmacy with melatonin and a few vitamin pills when I noticed Jean and Evelyn Miller coming out of St. John's Hospital. They were holding on to each other and looked like two women bound together by a shared grief. I discreetly watched them as they walked with their heads down and shoulders bowed, bereft of hope and dreams. They climbed into the Uber that was waiting for them and disappeared into the flow of traffic. What the hell was that? I ran through all the options that had been swirling around in my head since the previous evening, but nothing was coming out. Was my wife sick and didn't tell me about it? Was Evelyn sick? They looked grief-stricken and clinging to each other, but not sick. Neither of them looked sick. Maybe it was a mutual acquaintance? They looked too emotionally attached to the pain to be mere acquaintances. A friend, then? No, more than a friend. A lover? Yes, quite possibly a lover. But a mutual lover? Whatever and whoever it was, they both shared a deep affection. Say it, my mind insisted. Were they in love for each other? Maybe, but that wasn't it. Shit! So now what? So I did the rational and logical thing, or at least as rational and logical as was possible under the circumstances, and went to the meeting. I talked about the possibility of participating in CAA and left nothing out, including getting fired. At the first meeting, Julian Knowles said he would contact me later, after he discussed it with his investment club. The second meeting was with Aaron Goldstein, an old-fashioned retailer with a lot of money. He liked the idea immediately, and after spending some time at his computer shifting money around, he agreed to transfer $10 million into my trading account after the paperwork was completed. I was having coffee at Starbucks on Monroe when George called. He liked the prospectus and had a group of interested investors. We agreed on a sliding scale commission structure so that the higher the yield, the higher the commission percentage. I called my dad and discussed the COA opportunity, and he said he'd like to invest $100,000. He would wire the money the next day. I then discussed with Gene the whole situation I was in. He fell silent, and I mentally saw him scratching his head. My father's reasoning was slow and methodical. He worked as a risk analyst for one of the major insurance companies in the state. When he responded, it was with concern. Her behavior resembles that of a woman in mourning. Well, she wasn't mourning her mom or dad. They were both disgustingly healthy and lived in Arizona. Apparently, they liked the warm, dry climate. She had no siblings, and her few cousins were scattered all over the country and were almost strangers. We talked for another long time while I questioned his thoughts, and finally I had to agree with him. He bowed out, but not before telling me that he would send me the number of a private investigator whose services they had regularly used in the past to investigate insurance fraud. I went home, called my contacts in Singapore and Southeast Asia to get an update on sentiment in the country, and recreated the risk assessment profile for CA. It turned out to be virtually the same as my report. The numbers were rational, the management team was sound, the project was in its infancy, but the decisive fact was that all members of the management team had put their own money into it, and that was the decisive fact. They weren't just in the game. They were betting their future on the success of the project. That strengthened my position. Everything was ready. All that was left was to wait a few hours for SSE to open, and I would start trading. While I waited, I called the number of a private investigator. His name was Clarence Williams, and I found his LinkedIn profile and a small website under the company name, Discrete Solutions. There were no pictures of him. When I called, he spoke with a slow southern accent, and I got the feeling he spoke that way on purpose because his mind was like a steel trap and his questions were sharp and insightful. He asked for an advance of $5,000 and said that since my father had referred so many cases to him in the old days, he would start the next day. When everything was ready, I began to drink coffee, waiting for the time to pass. My nervous energy had peaked. Dean and Kathy came home late from sports practice, and I spent as much time with them as I could, but explained that I had important business to attend to. Jean arrived looking tired but more determined than the previous evening. I bought Chinese food on the way home, she announced, walking into my office and kissing me on the cheek. Are you working? Hi, Jin. No affectionate words came from her, so I didn't respond either, just like when I was a kid. I wish we could eat as a family, but I have to work tonight from about 7. Okay, that's fine, I guess, she said uncertainly. I have a present for your birthday. She held out a small gift-wrapped package. The small card read, Happy birthday, Adam. Love. John. I'd sent more personalized cards to third cousins and siblings. Inside was a bottle of Hugo Boss aftershave. I thanked her, and she leaned over to kiss my dry lips. I could very well have been a third cousin. We ate as a family. Dean and Kathy talked about how their day had gone. John didn't say much. We discussed some of the changes that had occurred during my absence. Dean complained that the old skate park was closed and there was less and less for teenagers to do in town. Then Kathy said she thought it was a good thing that Mr. Miller, Mom's boss, had converted the house into a shelter for abused teens. I turned to Jean with a raised eyebrow. Well, yeah, I may have mentioned that, she admitted. Tony wants to set up a conservation project, and this is his way of doing it. She was very superficial in her details, and I sensed she was holding back a lot. I'm surprised. I didn't know Miller was into that kind of thing. I really was surprised. I thought he was from the country club. His wife Lynn started doing it while she was still alive, and he continued after she died. She informed me somewhat smugly, or was it something else I couldn't understand? He often used empty houses he owned for it, but now he wants to convert one of them into a permanent establishment. Why? Why not? She almost pounced on me. It's a great cause and much needed. It doesn't seem like the city or the state does much. A lot of these teenagers end up on the street, she wanted to say, but stopped when she heard young ears perk up at the table. I threw a glance at Dean and Kathy, nodding my head toward the door, and they withdrew to give Jean and I a chance to have an adult conversation. Why now? That's what I meant. I looked at her intently. There was something about it. Something she wasn't saying. Her face became impassive and something flashed in her eyes. Now the opportunity has presented itself. She nodded, as if to confirm the rightness of her words. Ah, good. That certainly sounds like a great idea. Springfield sure could use it, said I, smiling at her. She smiled back as we both got up to clean up the rest of the food. I tried my best to keep a pleasant expression on my face and not frown. She had lied to me. Maybe not everything, but now she had a good reason and this wasn't a possibility. Secondly, her body language suggested she knew a lot more and it had something to do with the personal. I helped clean up. Took out the trash and told her I was going to work in my office. It was still an hour before trading opened in Singapore, and I sat down at my desk and thought about the situation. I thought about my marriage, trying to keep my sanity and not give away the deeply buried pain that threatened to consume me. I knew that if I gave up now, I wouldn't be able to do what needed to be done. And at the same time, I realized that if I held the pain back, it would likely get worse. I wondered how we'd gotten to this state. Before, Jean and I had been compatible in almost every way. We agreed on where to live, how to spend our money, how to spend our vacations, when to have children and how many. We had a good life. To be fair, the last few years had been difficult because of my traveling and being away. But usually we made plans before I returned, and after I returned, we invariably had a mini honeymoon. But not this time. I thought we were both on the same page, but it turned out we weren't. It made me angry. Singapore and South Asia were full of women looking for non-Asian men. Some for the experience. Some because most foreigners held lucrative positions and had more to offer than their local counterparts. Some simply saw it as a ticket to the West. I was hit on daily. In the office. On the subway. In open-air food markets and especially in the many bars and clubs. Many of my coworkers dated local women. Some even put them in their apartments as de facto servants with privileges. Personally, I found this practice disgusting and exploitative, but no one cared about my opinion. The only reason I thought about it was that of the 10 times a week that I turned down a pretty woman, I did so because I was married. What's more, I was married to a woman I loved and who I thought loved me back, but her behavior and recent actions made me wonder if that was really the case. I looked back to consider if there were any warning signs leading up to this, but other than a near breakdown in communication over the past few weeks, I couldn't identify anything. There was much to ponder, but right now I had to focus on the work at hand. When the Singapore market opened, CA was trading at 8.49. I cautiously and methodically walked inside. There were many sellers and very few buyers, and any large purchase could cause unrest. I had over 30 million to play with. My contacts and George's contacts were top-notch. They trusted our expertise. God help us all. My first purchase was for 5 million from an unknown person. Then an avalanche of stocks hit the market as worried investors hoped to unload and salvage what they could. I was willing to bet it was my old company dumping shares at the urging of the head office. I kept buying at 5 million each, expecting the price to stabilize, but it was in free fall and kept falling despite my purchases. Someone was selling stock they didn't have in hopes of buying it back at the end of the day cheaper. The price continued to fall as panicked investors tried to get rid of their holdings in hopes of getting 25 or even 20 cents on the dollar. The price hit the $5.61 mark when I made my last purchase of $15 million. With our $30 million, we had purchased a little over 10% of the total number of shares listed. This meant that we could appoint someone to the board of directors, since we owned a significant block of shares, if we decided not to sell them, but to hold on to them and make a profit. I called George and we both drank whiskey over the phone. My choice was an 18-year-old J.P. Weiser's Canadian whiskey on the rocks. George, being an old and old-fashioned guy, poured himself a 10-year-old Bulleet bourbon. Our purchases ended up encouraging some investors sitting on the sidelines to buy at this bargain price. As a result, by the time I logged off, the price had steadily climbed to $8.72. The short sellers were stranded and lost money. I wiped my eyes and looked at the time. It was almost 2 o'clock in the morning. After cleaning myself up in 5 minutes, I quietly climbed into bed and passed out from the melatonin pills I'd forgotten in the car. I woke up late the next morning. Everyone was downstairs. Dean and Kathy were finishing breakfast. John was on the phone. I heard her say something about time is of the essence. When she saw me, she said goodbye to the person on the phone. Work. She shrugged exaggeratedly. She poured me a cup of coffee. You must have been up late? I nodded, taking a sip. So, did the trade or something go well? I mimicked her and shrugged unresponsively. She had no idea that everything but our house depended on CA. It's still early. We'll have to wait and see. I waved it off. Okay. She walked over and kissed my cheek. You still look tired. I'll take the kids to school. With those words, she walked out of the kitchen, calling out to Dean and Kathy as she went. They shouted bye and love you, Daddy, and left. I poured a second cup and headed to my office. I checked the stock price at the close and was pleased to see that they had gotten a late rally as market sentiment turned and closed the day at $10.14. Those who held the stock had to be pleased. Those who were short selling must have bathed in blood. Good. It was time to stabilize the stock and start trading to its potential, away from the games being played by hostile entities. I washed my face and started sending out emails and making calls. My first order of business was to catch up with our investment crowd. To do this, I started with the Miller Real Estate website. It was business as usual. A vision and mission statement with testimonials from happy sellers and buyers. There was a section about the company's social responsibility program, the essence of which was to help teenagers in trouble. They called it New Horizons House. They claimed to provide housing, food, training, counseling, and help troubled teens find jobs, finish school, get off the streets. I couldn't find anything else on their website, so I went to Facebook. I found Anthony Miller on Facebook, and it turned up a lot of pictures of his cars and vacations and people he knew and interacted with. There was also a recent group photo from one of the corporate events. The entire MRE team was there, Anthony standing in the center, with his daughter Evelyn sitting to his left and Jean on his right. Two things stood out. He seemed to have lost a lot of weight and looked much older and, if not worse, haggard. The second thing I noticed was that Jean was holding his hand and looking at him instead of at the photographer. It didn't mean anything because you can read anything into moments like that in a Renoir painting. But still, I looked through Jean's Facebook pages and there was nothing much there but a few old photos and posts of the family, including the two of us, at a time that in my mind had come to be defined as better times. There was nothing but good news about her work, school, and sporting events. Everything was so banal and mundane that it held no interest. The last picture she took of us together was over 2 years ago. On Evelyn's Facebook, there have been a significant number of photos of her with Jean over the past few years. In some of the pictures, she was pictured with Jean and Anthony, but there was nothing objectionable in them other than the fact that they were spending time together. The last messages were somewhat cryptic about the meaning of life and praying to God and the universe for positive results. I had another conversation with Clarence Williams. Please call me Clarence Adam. I've worked with your father for so long that I feel like I know you. I told him I wanted to expedite the investigation. He said he'd try, but it all takes as long as it takes. Then I called my father. His advice was to stop drawing unfounded conclusions and homegrown theories, let the experts do their job, and finally give them time. He put it simply. I found myself in a quandary. Should I contact my wife and start fixing what was broken? Wouldn't that lead to more heartache later if I realized I had been played for a fool? On the other hand, if I did nothing and everything could have been fixed, how hurt I would be if I could have made a difference but didn't. There was a hot lawyer's office in town and I called. I got through to a staff member who advised that it was better to fix the marriage than to divorce. There are very rarely winners, she said. Mostly there are only losers. I had one last card to play. One of Gene's male colleagues owed me a small favor after I recommended some inexpensive but quality stocks to him. He had last worked at MRE about 6 or 7 months ago, but I decided to elicit some information from him. He worked for a competing real estate company, but was free for a late lunch, so we met at Red Robin for burgers and beers. Chad walked in wearing his trademark golf shirt, chinos, and Dockers, with a pair of sunglasses on his head. If he tried, he couldn't have looked more like a realtor. After pleasantries and general chatter while eating burgers, I got down to business. He laughed when my intentions became clear. So you're out fishing, Adam? I nodded. Why? I'm trying to understand something about MREs. I limited my explanation. Something came up that's been bothering me. He turned serious. Everything changed when Tony lost his wife Dot to cancer. He seemed to lose his drive for a long time. Then his daughter became the driving force, and over the next year or so he seemed to find himself again. He paused and looked at me shrewdly. Your wife and he became very close. She was sometimes referred to as his office wife. He paused to gauge the effect he was having on me, and I gestured for him to continue, for my throat constricted, and I feared that if I tried to speak it would come out as a croak. I didn't see anything inappropriate, but you know how cruel office gossip can be. He scratched his head. One thing I can say is that Tony, Evelyn, and your wife spent a lot of time together, but you weren't home that often, were you? I shrugged helplessly. We talked about the subject without adding anything new. He was about to leave when he suddenly remembered something. You do know that Anthony was rumored to have been diagnosed with cancer, right? We said goodbye, but I stayed and called St. John's Hospital. I presumptuously asked what room Anthony Miller was in. It turned out that he was in a private room in the oncology ward. I paid for lunch and headed home. I had a lot to think about. This evening went much like the previous two, except that after cleaning up, I went outside with a whiskey and a charcuterie. For a while I sipped and puffed away. The neighborhood was quiet. Jean came out with a glass of wine in her hand. Can we talk, Adam? Shoot. You went on the MRE website, she accused me. Apparently he was a little more advanced than I expected. I guess if they intercepted visitor data, they could use it to make contact. And? I want to know why. Why what? Why did you go to the company's website? What do you expect to find? I assume you've also checked everyone's Facebook page? She glared at me, daring me to say the wrong thing to start an argument or start a confrontation. We'd been married long enough for me to recognize those signs. What did you expect to find? Exactly what I found. I made a poker face. And what was that? Why are you questioning me, Jean? I'm not interrogating you. It feels like you're spying. Social media pages hardly qualify as private space. I laughed and she blushed. Evelyn said you also went on her Instagram, she accused. Really? Yeah, she took a deep breath and tried to pull herself together. Why are you acting like this? How? Like this right now. Why do you think that, Jean? I looked at her stone-faced and blew smoke in her direction, knowing how much she hated it. She waved her hand, dispersing the smoke, and spilled some wine on her blouse. Please stop, Adam, she began to cry. In a normal situation, I would have enclosed her in a hug, but not this time. Why are you crying, Jean? I looked at her without emotion. You're upsetting me with your behavior, Adam. She growled louder to get her point across, but I only let out more smoke, creating a small cloud. Who are you? I asked her. She tried to formulate an answer, but remained voiceless for a while. Finally, she found her voice. I am your wife, Adam Carter. That's who I am. She looked at me. I'm not sure. I stepped back as she gasped and ran into the house. I finished my drink and went to my office to work. CEA's stock was rising strongly and had risen to $11.92, and it looked like the trend was going to continue. George and I talked it over and agreed that this was a trend, not a spike. I stayed online and continued to monitor the activity in the market. With the exception of the blue chip stocks, which were in a mild uptrend, the rest of the market was volatile, but within expected boundaries. CA was the only stock showing significant upward movement, but yet it was still far from its listed price. It seemed that we were seeing some profit taking on the part of those who bought low. I texted one of my JP Morgan team members, and he admitted that they had managed to dump about half of the stock at 50 cents on the dollar, but my former boss Joe Ratledge told me to hold the rest and wait, as the trend looked positive, and maybe they could eventually come out in the plus side. We both laughed a little. He said that JP Morgan might eventually want to rehire me and fire Ratledge. That night, I grabbed a spare blanket and slept on the fold-out couch in my office. The next morning, I checked the closing prices on SGX again and was pleasantly surprised to see that SEAA had closed at $13 and a few cents. The trend continued as predicted, and our investors doubled their money. Now, if we had managed to reach the predicted $25, we would have made over 300% profit. I made breakfast and called the kids to eat while I drank coffee. I completely ignored Jean all morning and then drove the kids to school. After dropping them off, I headed to the gym and went to IHOP for a very late breakfast. I made some calls, and when I got home, I had a 2-hour meeting with George. We talked about starting a combined brokerage company with offices in Springfield and Chicago. We discussed the idea and agreed that he would begin working on the structure and equity in the new business, and I would develop a plan to go to market. I was in the process of drafting the document until late in the afternoon when I heard Jean come in. She was alone. I left Kathy and Dean at the Beckers for the night, she informed me. We need to talk. She invited me to come into the living room. She poured me a bourbon on the rocks and herself a glass of wine. I sat down and waited for her to begin. Usually whoever starts talking first loses, so I sat in silence, sipping my drink until she got excited and started. I don't know what you think I've been doing while you've been away, Adam. I haven't thought about anything yet. Well, you're being very disrespectful and ugly to me. The woman was right about that. Is that how you feel? I raised an eyebrow. Disrespectful? She started to nod, then realized it was hypocrisy and took up the water. I'm sorry, Adam. You're not home anymore. We're like two strangers. She snorted with some satisfaction at her terse description. So after 17 years, we're strangers because I've been gone for 4 months? All the Skypes, all the texts, all the phone calls didn't matter? There was a lot of pressure on me, and you were far away. She wiped tears from her eyes. But you're my husband, and I'm your wife, and that's all that matters. She flashed her eyes, daring to contradict me. She stood up and withdrew. I sat there sipping my bourbon, wondering if this woman had lost her mind. I heard her cell phone ring as she spoke, unable to make out the words. Soon all I heard was the murmuring of the water in the bathtub. It was some time before she came downstairs. She was wearing a soft, knitted gray dress that ended a palm above her knees, a pair of black shoes, and a single string of pearls I had bought her in the Far East a few years ago. Go take a shower and get dressed, she told me. I'll make a reservation at the Chesapeake Seafood Restaurant. I was ready in 15 minutes. I dressed with the feeling that she was on the phone with someone again. I ignored my instinct and bit my tongue. We drove to a restaurant where she started with a gin and tonic in the lounge since Jean had discovered gin. I deliberately beat her to it by ordering a Singapore gin sling. Later, when we were seated in the dining room, she ordered a hot pot of mussels and I ordered half a dozen oysters and a half shell for first. We drank Chardonnay and talked about the kids. She didn't seem very concerned about me losing my job. You're one of the smartest people I know, Adam. I believe you'll find a job quickly. She smiled at me. Apparently, she had no idea that I was now a pariah in the corporation. Anyway, our savings will help us get by until you get settled. I almost snorted with laughter and concern. She had no idea that our entire future now depended on my stubborn unwillingness to admit that I was wrong about CA. Nevertheless, the evening got better, not worse, as we discussed friends, parents, and the usual everyday topics that are the foundation of any marriage. She asked about some of my former coworkers she met at company parties. I shied away from talking about MREs until I had some information. Then it was time for the main courses. I ordered the captain's platter and she ordered the lobster. She treated me to wine and I drank it, wondering if she was trying to get me drunk. Because if she was, she had succeeded. The evening passed easily as we basked against each other. I have to say that if she was having an affair or cheating on me with someone, she did a great job of showing me how much she missed me. She caressed my hand, looked into my eyes, and was 100% attentive. We finished our meal and headed home. I woke up to the smell of coffee and bacon. I pulled on my sweatpants and went downstairs. She was making scrambled eggs and bacon and English muffins in the toaster, apple juice was on the table, and coffee was boiling. We ate breakfast together, and she told me about what needed to be done around the house and in the backyard. After that, she got dressed and went to get Dean and Kathy. I was in the backyard getting ready to start a little cleaning up after the winter when I noticed my phone ringing. Answering the call, I hummed along to the radio. It was Clarence Williams. "Can you talk?" he asked, and my life turned to solid shit. We arranged a quick meeting at a coffee shop downtown. I left my work unfinished, cleaned myself up, and walked in. He was waiting and waved when he recognized me. He was nothing like I expected based on TV shows and movies. He was a small, unassuming man. He was no more than 5'7" or 8, thin, gray-haired, and balding. He wasn't very swarthy, but he wasn't one of those light-skinned black men either. He was wearing dark pants, a shirt, and an old sports jacket. Even his shoes looked like they were bought at Walmart. All in all, he was a nobody. He probably drove a Toyota. However, his high-end cell phone didn't match his outward image, and I inwardly smiled. He had clearly cultivated that image of an unremarkable lowlife. We shook hands, and his firm grip further confirmed my impression of who he really was, as opposed to the image he was cultivating. He cut to the chase without further preamble. "Let's not beat around the bush, Mr. Carter. We didn't catch your wife at the hotel or in any secret meetings." He held up a hand to prevent me from intervening. "But we have ample corroborating evidence that she's been having an affair with her boss Anthony Miller for at least 2 years. That seems to be an open secret in the office. Of course, his daughter Evelyn knows about it and not only condones it, but facilitates it in every way possible. They met regularly during the week, and it seems that when you weren't home, she would often leave the children with friends and move in with him herself for the weekend. He was hard and relentless, trying to lay it all out before I exploded, or whatever it was I was going to do. His voice began to lose volume as my pulse quickened and drummed in my ears. My hands clutched at the table like I was having a heart attack. It's one thing to think your wife is having fun with another man, and quite another when it's confirmed by a near stranger. Clarence kept talking, but I could barely hear anything. I was still burning inside and struggling to pull myself together. Besides, Mr. Miller has been diagnosed with a very aggressive pancreatic cancer, and he only has a few months to live. What? I tried to realize. What was that? I said that Miller has been diagnosed with metastatic pancreatic cancer. He's now undergoing therapy for the second time, but it doesn't seem to be working. This confirmed what Chad had said and what I had discovered, but I didn't know that the cancer was incurable and inevitable. I finally understood Jean's behavior. Her state of mind. Everything said she was in pain because she was mourning the man she loved. She was trying to come to terms with his impending demise. I told Clarence about Jean's behavior and how I thought it all connected, not because he was my friend. Not because he was my confidant, but because he was here in front of me and I just needed someone to talk to. My initial impression of Clarence's hidden depths was confirmed by his next words. Many cheaters try to minimize their actions by saying it was just sex. Or that it meant nothing, but that's nonsense, Mr. Carter. He took a sip of his almost cold coffee and made a grimace. Then looked at me again. Cheaters don't just do it. They're invested in each other and in the relationship. He frowned, as if fishing the words out of his memory. Women need to feel loved. No one has a long-term relationship because of sex. They may start out that way, but after a while, feelings emerge. Love, and it's usually justified by the claim that you can love more than one person. He looked up, assessing the effect his words had on me. Cheaters don't spend all their time having sex, Mr. Carter. They go to restaurants and movies. They go for walks and share experiences. They discuss movies, books, politics, and ideas. They develop a personal language as spouses. They share their hopes and dreams and invariably lament that their illicit relationship is not their permanent relationship. He nodded his head as if agreeing with himself. They typically find faults in their spouse to appease their behavior and justify their cheating, and then discuss their spouse's real, perceived, or attributed faults with their other in an attempt to justify their immoral activities. I was shocked and devastated. I mean, I understood all of that, but honestly, it wouldn't have hurt as much to think that they were dating to engage in it. My wife was in a relationship with another man who gave her all the same things I did, but without the burdens of raising children, settling life's scores, household chores, and all the rest. She gave him all of her attention. He gave her the good times without the daily drudgery that a normal marriage is saturated with, and nothing that would turn their time into the less exciting and more routine life that husbands and wives mostly share. We talked some more and then agreed to stop investigating for a while I considered my next steps. He left, and I was left to sit and ponder what my life now looked like. One thing I knew for sure: my marriage was over. And this delusional reasoning of staying together for the sake of the children was beyond me. As unpleasant as the thought of being separated from my children was, the reality was that 60% of children in the US live in separated or divorced families anyway. I guess mine would be no different. I sipped my rapidly cooling coffee. The pain coursing through my insides was real, and at the very least, it was going to take its toll on Jean and Miller. I did my best to muffle my emotions. These angry, hurt, anguished, and somewhat irrational thoughts wouldn't help me. I thought back to my work in the Far East, where I had encountered quite a few old-style executives. They tended to view business and even life in multi-generational terms. They also behaved much like the Southern Europeans. When two families went to war, there was and would be no reprieve until one of them was completely wiped out. Easier said than done. I wasn't the head of a triad or a godfather in the mafia. I was just an ordinary man living a fairly ordinary life. I didn't have any superpowers, nor did I have some omnipotent ally who owed me a great deal. The only thing that was certain was that I was in this case alone. I asked for more coffee to be brought in and pondered, wondering how I was going to get revenge on a dying man. As far as Jean was concerned, it was simple. Something she loved and treasured had been taken from her. In other words, everything she valued in life. Easier said than done, but a plan had already matured in my mind. But first things first. My real and immediate problem was Miller. I knew he'd made no promises of fidelity to me. He wasn't married to me, he was married to Jean. Yet he knew she was married and went after her anyway, thus disrespecting me, my marriage, and my children. Intelligence had to be done. My anger, fueled by pain, began to flare up again. All of my early psychological evaluations at work revealed, among other things, two traits that needed to be monitored and managed. First, I was risk-averse, which was certainly a double-edged sword to keep an eye on in a company characterized by a conservative approach to trading, and second, I was stubborn to the point of becoming intransigent as soon as I chose a position, and it was these two traits that were driving me now. I retaliated regardless of the consequences, and I would not back down until one side was defeated, even if that side was me. The embryo of a plan began to form in my head. I called Clarence and, without going into detail, asked him to find as many troubled women as possible that the Millers had helped through their program. It wasn't a fully formed plan. It was mostly just another fishing trip, but I was catching big fish. In 2014, I was transferred to our Kenya branch for 3 weeks, and on a free weekend, I joined a local team for some deep-sea sport fishing in the Indian Ocean. There I learned some valuable lessons. You don't go fishing for marlin. First, you fish trolling with brightly colored bonito spoons, the local name for a small tuna known in the US as false albacore and in Hawaii as kava kava. You lure the live musky fish toward you, then thread a line through it, bait hooks along the length of its body, and catch a marlin using it as live bait. On that trip, I was both successful and saddened to see a marlin fighting for its life, and vowed that it would be my only attempt at big game fishing. But the lesson learned from catching the marlin gave me a plan. I drove home, doing breathing exercises until I came to my senses and could pretend I was in the same mood as before. She still wasn't home, and I went about the business I had left undone. Later, she came back with Dean and Kathy, and we fired up the grill and cooked steaks and corn on the cob with coleslaw and warmed baguettes. I spent the day as an active father and a dutiful and loving husband. I was two people living in one body, a warm and loving man on the outside and a cynical bastard on the inside. Cynical Adam decided that since her lover was dead and she feared I might put two and two together, she was trying to do damage control. I was clearly her backup plan. My time with Dean and Kathy was as real as my time with Jean, like a B-movie, but she genuinely believed it. Cynical Adam told me to keep that in mind after the divorce when I was looking for women to hook up with. The next few days turned into a strange existence in which I was simultaneously living a lie and watching myself play my chosen role. I wondered if movie and television actors have similar experiences, watching themselves on screen as a character. On a positive note, George and I sorted out the new trading organization, registered it in Singapore, and transferred the entire SEA portfolio there. But that wasn't the only good news. CEA was trading at $16.33 after the roller coaster ride to market and climbing upward. We had already more than doubled our investment, and as I had hoped, were looking at a threefold return. Given how easily I had sunk into my psychopathic personality, I became paranoid, So I added some significant security measures that required a fingerprint and password, as well as encryption of all my files and emails. I always turned off my laptop and completely deleted all emails that didn't come from George without opening them. Then I would also upload everything I wanted to the cloud and reformat my phone, completely deleting everything and then re-uploading what I needed. After that, all that was left was to research other interesting stock listings and call potential investors I knew from JP Morgan in anticipation of me making an offer to buy some of their business. The only thing I wasn't too worried about was the non-compete clause, as the layoff made it mostly invalid. My marriage front went quiet while I waited for the ammunition to arrive, and it arrived on Thursday in the form of a flash drive from Clarence. The handover was done at a different coffee shop than last time because my paranoia was at an all-time high, albeit for no particular reason. He made a list of 14 women. It was everyone he could find. There were brief biographies, and some even had old photos attached. 5 still lived here. One of them worked as an escort. A prostitute, to be exact, so Miller's intervention didn't help her much. She had a number. I went and bought a cell phone, then called her, and we arranged to meet at a motel on the outskirts of town. She said an hour was $100 and I would have to pay for the room. She arrived on time, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. She was small, thin, and tattooed. Her name was Layla, and she stood in the doorway. "Show me the money." Those were her first words. I pulled $200 out of my pocket, placed the bills on the bed, and gestured for her to sit down. I raised my hand to stop her. "How do you feel about making 1,000?" I asked, but she jumped up, grabbing her bag. "I don't do shit, mister." "No shit," I assured her. "I'll pay for the information." "What kind?" "I want to know about the home for abused and vulnerable women you were in a few years ago." She wasn't sure, but after some thought, she agreed and told her story. Briefly, she said that she left home as soon as she left school because she hated her stepfather and ended up on the streets. Eventually, having lost all hope, she began selling herself for food and lodging. One John, when she didn't want to do what he wanted, threw her out on the street like trash. She was found by passers-by who called the police. They took her to the hospital, and someone contacted Mrs. Miller, who offered her a place in the house once she was discharged. She stayed there for almost 6 months, she said, until the rules and regulations bored her and she left. She finished her story and we looked at each other in silence for a while. Her story was typical, though no less tragic. I wondered if what I was about to do would be another case, but the need for revenge took over everything else. "So, when you lived in this house, were you bullied right away or did it start later?" She blinked rapidly, trying to comprehend my question. She started to shake her head no, side to side, then froze. I could see the gears turning in her head. "How much?" "I think 5,000. I began to negotiate. "Why?" I thought about it for a few minutes. She may have been an uneducated prostitute, but her negotiating skills were good enough for any corporate boardroom. "Miller ruined my marriage and I want to destroy it." I looked at her for signs of hesitation. Whether she'd do it for the money or for the greater good. 20,000? She smiled grimly, watching me like a hawk to gauge my reaction. I hesitated, figuring out how plausible she could be. She smirked, looking at me. "What?" "I can see you pondering whether spending 20 grand on an unimportant person will help your cause." Damn. This young tattooed woman was on a roll. She leaned toward me and we ended up nose to nose. "Give me a 25 and I'll show you the power of the Me Too movement in action." I told her we had to plan it out and arrange how the money would be transferred. She told me that she wanted the money so she could get a fresh start elsewhere since she had a little girl and needed to get out of the business. I offered her honestly that if it worked out, I would set her up with a job in Chicago, and her eyes lit up. "For real?" "For real. You're tricking me just to get what you want?" She looked both hopeful and scared at the same time, like a child who is about to reach for the candy, but knows it could be taken away at any moment. I managed to reassure her that everything was fine. We agreed that she would do what she promised, and we would meet to discuss next steps as soon as she was ready. We exchanged numbers. I gave her my phone number and asked her to save it under Jerry's name. I begged off and phase 1 was complete. At home, I continued my dichotomy of inside and outside, and Jean seemed to keep buying into it. To be fair, she too was focused on the Miller Legacy project to notice much else. I was getting inside as much as I could without making her suspect anything, and getting information about how far the project had gotten. We cooked and ate together like old times. During breakfast, she said she'd be busy helping set up New Horizons House, and there would be a grand opening on Monday at 10. I already knew about it. It was written about on the company website and social media. I feigned interest and, without appearing to, questioned her. Turns out they were planning to have the mayor and his entourage cut the ribbon. A whole bunch of local media was also supposed to be there, as well as the CBS television station. Did they stop the chemo and radiation so Tony could feel well enough to attend? I heard her ask. Probably Evelyn's. I didn't hear an answer. It's going to be a life-changing moment, she sobbed slightly. Not if I had anything to do with it. Time to turn up the heat. My divorce papers were ready. All that remained was to get permission to file them. Illinois was a no-fault state in 2016, and there were no laws allowing me to sue Miller for loss of affection either, so it was a matter of irreconcilable differences. I started the day on SGX. Our stock had reached its issue price and was rising, albeit in small increments. A good start to Friday. I had a coffee and tuned into the WMA radio station. At 9:30, there was an interview with Evelyn. She was talking about the wonderful social responsibility program that MRE and her father, Anthony Miller, have been up to. It was soulful stuff, like chicken soup for the soul. She explained that the New Horizons house is simply an ongoing evolution of a program that her mother started, and after her mother's death, her father continued. Now there was an opportunity to turn it into a full-fledged project with full funding, but obviously it would work better with community participation and donations. The host spoke almost enthusiastically about the value of the project and then asked listeners for their opinions. WMA listeners spoke favorably and some promised to donate. The presenter promised to put donation information on the WMA homepage, and Evelyn said there are details on the MRE website and on the New Horizons website. More calls in the same vein followed until... Hello? The voice on the other end was hesitant. She was urged to speak louder, and between a broken voice and quiet sobs, she managed to raise her voice. Please don't believe the house helped anyone, she managed to croak out. All it did was allow Mr. Miller to abuse women. She burst into tears over the phone. Evelyn went into an apoplectic fit. Never. This never happened. My father is a good man. He would never do anything like this. The caller was still on the line. He did, and more than once. Her voice rose with justifiable indignation and anger. Do you know what I am now? She shouted in a breaking voice. I'm a whore. I work the streets. That's all I'm worth thanks to your precious daddy. Her pain was unbearable. My name is Layla, and your father ruined me. She sobbed, and the connection cut off. The station went into a commercial break. When they returned, the anchor was torn between his original interview and addressing the elephant that filled the airwaves. Evelyn was stunned by this turn of events and tried to explain that it was nonsense and that her father was a good man who would never do anything like that. It was obvious that she believed that, but then again, we all want to believe the best about our parents. All the lines were ringing with people both scolding and praising Layla. One said what you'd expect from a whore. She's clearly trying to make a buck. Some wanted to ask questions of Evelyn, while others suggested that the authorities, whoever they were, should intervene. The talk show host was no fool. It turned from a little low-interest story into an emotional maelstrom, with listeners adding their opinions on what was real and what wasn't. The furor reached its climax when a well-modeled voice came on the air. My name is Rita. I don't want to give my last name on the air. Her voice was shaky but determined. But I left it with your producer so I can be contacted. She took a shuddering breath. Anthony Miller abused me too. And the remarks went off in different directions. A listener called into WTX to discuss what was happening on WMA. In the next minute, the line was filled with pro and con voices on each side. A short time later, a woman called in. She spoke in a thin, frightened voice. I'm a married woman with children, she cried, and I had hoped to put all this behind me, but Mr. Miller has been harassing me too. She broke down and sobbed on air. I'm so sorry, I promised. I promised I wouldn't say anything. But I can't live with this. I was young and I needed help, and he made me do anything to him. I couldn't say no. I didn't know how. She disconnected. There was a long silence before Master could say anything. It sounded like he was crying. I called Vicky, an old high school friend who works at the local newspaper and anchors the news for 2 regional radio stations. I asked if she had heard about what was going on at WMA and WTX. She had. I told her I was concerned because my wife works for MRE and the New Horizons Home Project. I asked her opinion. She wasn't sure but was going to look into the matter. She said if it was true, it would be the biggest abuse case in Springfield in 2 generations. By lunchtime, the story had gone quiet on the air. None of the radio hosts wanted to offer an opinion. However, social media and Twitter in particular went wild. At first, opinions were split 50 and 50 for and against, but within hours it turned into a fierce witch hunt, and woe betide anyone who sided with Miller. Hundreds and then thousands of women took to the platforms to tell their stories of abuse from a variety of sources. Some were detailed, others were nothing more than an admission of "me too." Some were so graphic that they could be categorized as X-rated. Within hours, it was impossible to distinguish truth from nonsense. The information went viral and spread not only across states, but entire continents. I passed out with a massive headache. I reached for the Tylenol. The day was early and the kids were still in school. From the stress and emotions I had experienced, I was sweating and feeling dirty. I undressed in the laundry room, walked naked to the shower, and collapsed under a stream of warm water. I sat down and cried like I hadn't cried since my mom died. In fact, I cried harder. Losing my mom was a knife to my heart, but it was a knife to my soul. I had crossed a line that could no longer be crossed. Nietzsche's saying that he who fights monsters must be careful not to become a monster himself accurately described me. Miller had done bad things to me, but I had unleashed a firestorm that had already lost control. All I could do now was hang on and pray. I picked up Dean and Kathy and drove home to make chicken stir-fry with noodles and a small oriental salad on the side. We waited for Jean, but there was nothing. I tried to call her, but her phone was off. We finally ate, and I put a plate of food for Jean in the microwave and a small bowl of salad in the refrigerator. Dean, Katie, and I sat down to play the Forbidden Island board game, and Jean was still gone. By 10, the kids had gone to their bedrooms, and I was alone in the living room when she came in. She looked like she'd just been through the ringer. The shadows over her eyes were streaming. Her hair was a mess, and she had the aura of a woman whose world had just crumbled. "You heard?" She sighed with a shudder. "Have you heard all the nasty things they say about Tony?" She groaned, collapsing into a chair. I handed her a large brandy, which she gratefully accepted, drinking half of it in one gulp. "Yeah, sounds like your boss is a predator," I told her in an even, emotionless voice. "Where there's smoke, there's fire." "No, Adam. He's a good man? He would never do anything like this. Time to get to phase 2. Jean?" She looked up from her brandy. "You obviously didn't know the man very well." "You don't know me." I turned the screws. "You and I have no secrets. We're husband and wife, so you know what I'm capable of, just like I know you." I held her gaze. "You may know Miller as your boss, but who knows what he's really like?" I watched the conflicting thoughts and emotions play across her face. No, he's a good man. He would never do anything like that." "I would know." I threw her a helplessly confused look. "But how is Jean?" "How do you know?" "I mean, he's your boss, your coworker. He could be hiding a million secrets." "I haven't interacted with him that much, but I always felt like he was hiding something. He's the kind of guy you wouldn't leave alone with your wife or daughters." She sighed. "And he, you know, has he ever tried anything with you?" She turned white and I pretended not to notice. No, never." "How can you even ask that?" She tried to snark at me, but ended up just looking dumbfounded. "Because you're a pretty woman, Jean, and if what they say about him is true, he must be very immoral." She burst into tears and looked deeply into her glass of brandy, but found no answers there either. She finished it and headed upstairs tiredly. She said hello to Dean and Kathy and said goodnight, and then I heard the shower running. I finished my cognac and headed to bed. By the time she got out of the shower, I pretended to be half asleep. She came downstairs in her robe. I climbed out of bed and made my way to the landing. She was talking to someone. From the sound of it, probably to Evelyn. She repeated nightmare several times. Then she asked, "But why? Why isn't there more than one woman saying she was attacked?" Finally, she said she didn't think it would go away easily. How right she was. She made a second call. "Hi, Tony," I heard her say. I caught snippets of phrases where she kept telling him that everything would be resolved, and it was some big misunderstanding. I barely heard her remove herself to the kitchen, but I caught her last words. "I love you too." I heard the microwave beeping and she spent some time alone, probably snacking. By the time she got to bed, I was asleep. Saturday, I woke up first and made breakfast and then drove Dean and Kathy to sports practice. When I got home, I was on the phone with Vicky. She informed me that another woman had applied and there were 4 so far. She also told me that her sources in the mayor's office said that the entire project was now considered toxic and was being distanced from it. A number of civic associations soon followed with denials. By mid-morning, the Attorney General's office had issued a statement that they would conduct a full investigation into the matter. By the time I got home, it was gone. The SGX exchange was closed, so there was nothing to do. I talked to George about business and to my father about the state of my marriage. He agreed that it was irretrievably broken. He said he felt sorry for Dean and Kathy, but like the rest of the kids in the U.S., they would learn to cope. I called Jean. "Where are you?" "Evelyn and I and the company lawyers are trying to fight these nasty lawsuits." "Are you sure you should get involved?" I colored my voice with concern. "The spillover could be significant and you don't want to be in it." She resisted, as I knew she would, but all their lawyerly entreaties went nowhere. On Saturday afternoon and Sunday, which were the busiest days of the show, MRE had less than 20% of its previous attendance. By Monday morning, the phones were ringing off the hook with calls of canceled and withdrawn sales orders. The opening of the New Horizons home was postponed until the negative publicity was over. That Monday, another woman made herself known in an unusual way. This woman was married to a wealthy businessman and was well known in the community. According to her, she spent a total of 8 days in the house before she gave them her name, and they contacted her parents. During that time, the man she knew as Mr. Miller abused her twice. She left her lawyer's details for all the women who had been assaulted by Miller to contact him so they could file a class action lawsuit. By the end of that week, 5 things had happened. First, Miller was interviewed by the district attorney at the hospital, after which his condition deteriorated. Second, 3 of the 5 women came to the police and testified. All of them claimed to have been assaulted. Interestingly, all of the assaults occurred within a short period of time, about 5 years ago. Third, the media storm escalated to the point where MRE closed its doors until further notice. Jean naively told me every night about how Evelyn was trying to keep the business going while vendors were leaving and taking customers with them. Fourth, CA had passed the $24 mark, and I was slowly throwing blocks of shares onto the market, which were quickly snapped up without lowering their price. We made back our original investment and still owned 2/3 of the stock. To put it bluntly, we sat back in complete delight. My dad took Dean and Kathy out for the weekend. I was on my way back from a small boutique where I bought a chilled bottle of 2012 vintage Veuve Clicquot. I was ready to celebrate with Jean number 5. I noticed a BMW X5 SUV with the MRE logo on the doors parked in my driveway next to Jean's Lexus. I stopped and walked into the house. They were in the living room. Jean was crying and Evelyn was stroking her back and generally calming her down. "Ladies." I saluted them, walked over to the cabinet where our crystal was kept, and pulled out 3 champagne flutes. They stared at me dumbfounded with open mouths as I tore off the foil, twisted the wire to remove the cage, and popped the cork with opulence. Then I filled 3 flutes copiously and handed them each one. They were both in a sort of stupor, as if their brains were tilted, and accepted the proffered glasses. "Salute." I raised my toast, drank half of mine, and burped. Then the shouting began. "Jean, you're divorcing me?" "I thought we were a family." I noticed an open envelope with divorce papers lying on the coffee table. "Evelyn, how could you, Adam? Don't you care about your wife? Don't you love her? Have a drink, Jean. We're celebrating the end of an era." I finished the rest of the champagne and reached for the bottle. "Hello, Evelyn. First of all, I could, and I did. Second, I stopped caring about her and stopped loving her when she became your father's whore." I knocked over my glass and saluted Evelyn. "Let's drink to your father's legacy, Evelyn. I hope he lives long enough to stand trial, and then the whole world will know what a piece of shit he really is." She turned white and collapsed onto her back. I turned to Jean. "Get yourself a lawyer." I smirked at her. "The kids will stay with my father until custody is established." Her eyes widened with fear. This was like nothing she'd ever seen me like before. It looked like I had turned into the very monster I feared. Evelyn dropped her flute on the carpet, making a mess. They looked at me the way one looks at a madman with his finger on the trigger. "So for champagne, no. You left me alone for so long and so often." "I needed human contact." She tried to justify herself but couldn't meet my gaze. "I understand." I laughed humorlessly. "And how do you manage that now?" But then Evelyn came at me again. "And how many women did you sleep with while you were away from home? You men all want your women to be angels when you're away from home, and you do whatever you want. Don't think all men act like the piece of shit who gave birth to you. Just because he was happy to do whatever he could, ruining young women and marriages, doesn't mean the rest of us stoop to his depravity." I stared at her, hoping she would try to object or even pounce on me. I leaned into her face. Your father is a molester, a criminal, a disgusting pig. He'll probably die before he goes to prison. But you, my whore wife, and the world will recognize him for what he is. His legacy project will never take off and his money will be frozen by the courts against future lawsuits by his victims. MRE will file for bankruptcy and cease to exist, and you'll have to move far away and change your name. She trembled and cried at my verbal assault. I bet she wished she was a man to hit me. I wished she was a man too, so I could unleash the rage I'd so carefully contained for the past weeks. In fact, it seems to me, Evelyn, that you probably helped woo these girls the way Ghislaine Maxwell did Jeffrey Epstein. Her mouth worked wordlessly at the horror I was spouting. I think I need to contact the news media to let them know about you. She shook her head from side to side, her eyes widened with fear and horror. No. Please, I didn't do this. It's all a lie. Some kind of mistake. I don't know what these women are trying to accomplish, but it's not true. My father is a good man. I turned to Jean. You have 2 hours to gather your clothes and leave. When I return, if you're still here, I'll call the press and make a statement. Moreover, I will invite them to interview you about your involvement in this horrible crime. Screw you, she spat at me. I have nothing to apologize for. Well, except for cheating and lying. I'll move out, but I'll hire a lawyer first thing, and then we'll see who gets what. Oh God, Jean found the strength. 2 hours, I promised her. I got out and headed for the car, but had only gone a few blocks down the road when all the unused adrenaline in my body caught up with me, and I gasped and shook. This went on for about 15 minutes before I got my body under control and was able to move on. For a while, I drove aimlessly around the city. Eventually, I pulled myself together and called my father. I told him about Jean's handing over the papers and reiterated that he should keep Dean and Kathy with him until further notice. And while he should allow Jean to visit them, under no circumstances should she be left alone with them to set them against me. We talked and I drove off before the car signaled that I was on standby. I found a gas station, got gas and headed home, marveling at how far from home I was, and by the time I got back it was 10 o'clock. The house was like a mausoleum, filled with the ghosts of happy times. The silence was noisy in my ears and I couldn't sleep. 2,500 years ago, Socrates had said that life without exploration is not worth living, and I lay in bed, trying hard not to explore myself or look too deeply into my psyche because of the furor I'd made for revenge. The only thing I knew for sure was that things had gone too far and there was no stopping it. I was afraid that what was happening on social media was one thing, but if it went to court, things could unravel or fall apart. Would I not find myself implicated? I felt the need to get Layla out of town to at least eliminate my direct connection to the issue. Having decided this, I managed to sink into a half slumber. Waking up the next morning, I felt almost as tired as the moment I climbed into bed. After my morning rituals, I headed downtown to get some breakfast. I called the kids. They were doing well, but Dean already suspected that all was not well at home. I promised I'd talk to him and Katie soon. Over a cup of coffee, I reached Layla on the landline. So, did I do as well as I promised? I admitted that I had. We talked and confirmed that she was flying to Chicago the next day. I had already transferred money from my offshore trading account to one of George's offshore accounts. Then he had transferred small amounts to a bank account she had opened, and Layla was $25,000 richer and off to a job as a property management assistant organized by one of George's investment contacts who owned a number of commercial properties. I was drinking my second cup of coffee when Vicky called. 3 women have sued Miller seeking damages, she informed me. The papers will be served on Monday. We talked for a while. She said she and the news editors were surprised by the timing and how the whole story had unfolded. But she reasoned that it wasn't surprising in the current climate. Once the first woman, Layla, who claimed she was a prostitute, got publicity, the rest followed, as in the case of Harvey Weinstein. I spent the rest of Saturday with Dean and Kathy. I told them that their mom and I would be getting a divorce because she was having an affair with her boss, Anthony Miller. Kathy didn't quite understand what an affair was. Dean understood. She slept with Mr. Miller, Dad? I nodded sadly. Yeah, they've been sleeping together for a while now. Kathy was crying. Dean was unfazed. We packed up and, taking my dad with us, went to the golf course and hit a few buckets of balls. Dean and Kathy used some of my old clubs and both had a good natural swing. After eating dinner, we went to a Greek restaurant and eventually headed to bed. I went back to my quiet mausoleum and had another sleepless night. On Sunday, I got a call from her parents. They wanted to know if there was any hope of reconciliation. For the sake of the child, they said. How can I reconcile with a woman who has been having an affair with her boss for years? I asked. And that one happens to be a maniac. Jean may have even had a part in it. There was a collective sigh. Living in Arizona had weaned them off the bomb that had hit Illinois. It will all be figured out in court, I assured them and walked away, leaving them with a shattered view of their daughter. Life went on, mostly slowly and painfully. Dean and Katie moved back into my home, and my father moved in to help out. This essentially left me with a business that was gaining momentum, as George and I were getting lots of positive feedback. At the end of the second week, the hype around Miller had died down somewhat. Vicky informed me that a fourth woman had joined the class action lawsuit against Miller. But not Layla, I thought. That was odd. She was edgy enough and, it seemed to me, mercurial enough to get her piece of the pie. Oh well, that was a mystery for another day. I had a meeting between Jean's lawyers and my lawyers about the division of property. I had set up investment accounts for Dean and Kathy's education out of our combined cash or near-cash assets so they couldn't be touched. My last paycheck and payments from J.P. Morgan went directly into my offshore account, and her lawyers were still trying to get documents from my previous employer. So while they suspected there was some sort of golden handshake going on, they had no idea how much, but it was only a matter of time before they subpoenaed the HR documents. I offered to pay her nothing, as she had a job and was generally making a good living. She argued that there should have been at least $250,000 in cash and near assets. I assured them that they had been lost on unprofitable stocks. Both Jean and her lawyer called bullshit, but I laughed. Take the deal, Jean, or I'll take your house payment down and we'll fight over it until you run out of money for lawyers. I'll cripple you financially. Why are you being such an asshole? She looked at me. I deserve half of whatever is left of our marriage. Go to your second husband and ask him for money, Jean. It sounds like you had more of a marriage with him than you did with me. But you'd better hurry. He may not have any money left after those poor assaulted women get what he did to them. I wish I could say it was all over after that, but it wasn't. Not at all. It dragged on for months, but most of the cards were in my hands, and righteous anger kept me going. She hesitated from meeting to meeting. At one, she was saying that I made the whole relationship between her and Miller look much more serious than it really was. At the next meeting, she blamed me for her behavior. Then she wanted to know why we had to get a divorce and that we couldn't work it out. The next time I heard from her that she was going to give me to the cleaners, at another meeting where I refused to give in, her lawyer said he would get her back in the house immediately. I gave her my biggest grin I was capable of. You better be careful around me, Jean, or I will go to every possible media outlet to expose your complicity in this. She lost her white and turned gray like a heart attack victim. Try it and see what happens to you next. As I left the lawyer's office, I noticed Evelyn sitting in the foyer. She was glaring at me angrily. I smiled at her the way one smiles at the Walking Dead, and her smile faltered and faded. You should have stayed out of this, Evelyn. Well, what you sow is what you reap. 2 days later, Layla was another $5,000 richer, and the local newspapers, Twitter, and the rest of social media were ablaze with the latest revelations that Evelyn Miller had been helping her disgraced father, Anthony Miller. The DA's office has come under fire for not arresting Miller or taking action against his daughter. The DA's office spoke at a media briefing, stating that they were still in the early stages of the investigation. The press didn't hold back, and another storm erupted. The public was still reeling from the story of Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein. Soon the bloodlust was gripping Evelyn Miller as well. Miller was sued by 4 highly publicized women. I became seriously concerned and began having sleepless nights. Going to court was a huge risk for me and could have easily derailed the whole case. It was the 6th week since my return from Singapore. I was working from home as usual when the doorbell rang. It was Evelyn. What do you need? I wasn't going to pretend. Can we talk, Adam? No. I don't want to be associated with a predator like you. I glared at her and closed the door, leaving her standing outside. She called again. Just as I knew she would, she rang. Please, Adam. Just talk, she begged. I felt like laughing out loud. Where's your entitlement, bitch? Instead, I said, I don't think so. You just want to record me and try to get me to say something you can use for your own purposes. I won't, I promise. Good. Her eyes lit up, but I held out my hand, stopping her. But first, put your purse and phone in the car. Wait here. I closed the door, unobtrusively set my phone down, and pressed record. Okay, talk. I let her go and moved to the nearest couch. She looked unsure whether to stand or sit, but I motioned for her to sit across from me, and she sat on the edge, as if she might rush off at any minute. She brushed her loose hair out of her face and pulled herself together. I know it's you, Adam. You're the one who created this whole nightmare. I just stared at her without emotion. She probably thought I was a serpent in her Garden of Eden. Stop it now, Adam. I just sat there looking at her in silence and she changed the subject. I know you were hurt by Jean's affair with my father. Whoever was hurt, but this nonsense about my father subjecting women is a lie, and it needs to stop. It needs to be disproved. I laughed in her face. There's nothing I can do, Evelyn. It's up to the court now. Please, Adam. Please make it stop. I know you can. I smiled unhappily. Now that your world has collapsed, you want me to help you. Where were you when your father was entertaining my wife? Her face turned red again. Oh yes, you were helping, making sure she agreed to be your father's whore. We stared at each other in silence for a long time. I read her face as she picked and rejected arguments to change my mind. Finally, she said, "When will you stop, Adam? When will you be satisfied?" Her eyes grew cloudy, then tears rolled down her face and she visibly snickered. This was no pretense. This was a woman defeated. Not until your family is completely destroyed, Evelyn. She shuddered. Her eyes widened in horror. There will be no stopping. There will be no ceasefire. There will be no peace. I spoke slowly and purposefully. I wanted her to realize this wasn't a game. She couldn't back down. This was real. She realized the truth and fell silent as she thought about what I had said. Then she surprised me by coming back for another try. You want revenge on Adam? How? She clasped her hands together and stared at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. She was in her early 30s, unmarried, and had no children. Her Facebook pages indicated that she had recently broken up with her last partner, so she was single. Staggering, she reached the door and on unsteady legs ran to her BMW. I watched her drive unevenly down the street. I had conflicting feelings of satisfaction at having caused her pain and letting her know that more would follow. At the same time, I felt disgusted at my ability to be so callous and so cruel to another person's feelings. It was still early, but I wanted a drink. And maybe more than one. I spent the rest of the week in and out of law offices. In between, I continued to work on getting new clients. There was a listing on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange for a small IT company that looked promising, and a listing on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange for a natural gas exploration company drilling in the Indian Ocean off the coast of South Africa and Mozambique. George and I were completing due diligence before presenting them to a group of investors. The 4 women's class action lawsuit against Miller was in full swing. The Millers, led by Evelyn and her attorneys, were trying to mitigate the situation and reach an out-of-court settlement. The district attorney could not make up his mind how to prosecute a man on his deathbed. So we all waited with bated breath. I heard the Millers had been cleaned out of almost every penny. All the real estate owned by the company was sold, and the women got over $2 million each. The amount was not disclosed, but it was huge. It was effectively the end of MRE. I needed one more thing to complete my revenge, so I went to the hospital and entered Miller's room, looking official and walking as if I belonged to him, and no one had challenged me. I was there to make sure he knew who had ruined him, his legacy, and his whole life. He lived for 2 more days. Evelyn had him cremated. There were only 5 people at the small gathering after the cremation. One of them was Jean. She wanted to take Dean and Kathy with her. I told her I would see her dead first. You would, wouldn't you? She looked at me with a mixture of fear and hatred, very similar to the one Evelyn had during our last meeting. I didn't realize you were so vindictive. You ruined him. It was you, wasn't it? She cried. And for what? Because he and I had a relationship. You went crazy and ruined so many lives. Tears rolled down her face. I laughed harshly. You're the one who planted the seeds, Jean. You? Why didn't you just tell me you wanted someone else? It would have hurt me, but it would have been honest. We could have gotten a divorce and that would have been the end of it. But you chose to neglect me, and that was unacceptable. For a moment, she became thoughtful. I loved Tony, she admitted quietly. He gave me what I needed. When he was with me 100%. With you, I always felt like your job came first and I came second. She rummaged through her purse, found a pack of tissues, and wiped her eyes. Then, when we had Dean and Katie, I wasn't even in second place. It was your job, the kids, and I got whatever was left. She looked me in the eye. I needed someone to put me first for a change. I could have walked away and left her with my happy memories, but I didn't. I pulled out my phone. Listen to this. Was it worth it? She heard me say. No, he wheezed. You ruined everything I spent a lifetime working for. I laughed harshly. It's your own fault, Miller. I screwed you up big time. How? How did you find out? What? How did you find out about me using them? There was a long silence while I tried to comprehend what I'd said, and then I started laughing and couldn't stop. I dropped my phone. Then I finally got my laughter under control. I didn't do it. I started laughing again. Oh, miracle. I didn't know Miller. I thought I was making it all up, but now I realize why those 4 women pursued you the way they did. All it took was one little crack, and then it all burst. Screw you, Carter, he wheezed, panting. Those women owed me. He tried to sit up to show he still had some bravado left. Jean collapsed to the floor and fell into catatonia. I walked away. She was no longer my problem. Epilogue. When MRE was getting rid of assets as fast as they could to free up cash, I bought the house they were converting into New Horizons House for next to nothing. It took some effort to get all the players together, but everything fell into place as if it was predetermined. As soon as the deal was signed and sealed, I took out ads in the local papers and went on the radio announcing that I had purchased New Horizons House and would turn it into a full-fledged shelter for abused women. It would be run by women only, and men would have no part in its operations and daily affairs. I renamed it Joy Carter House in honor of my mother. Dad cried and kissed me. Dean and Kathy were impressed. The house was placed in trust. Dad and I and the 4 women who had sued Miller became trustees. They were all more than happy to be involved and contributed some of their newfound wealth to make the dream come true. The local and regional media called the project Phoenix and showered me and the women with praise, although I tried to stay as far away from the spotlight as possible. Besides being a social responsibility initiative, it also helped me look good in front of a judge when it came to my divorce. Jean ended up getting primary custody. I would pay alimony until Dean and Katie turned 18, and Jean could stay in the house until then, but she would have to contribute 50% toward the mortgage payment, and alimony would be 0 for her. At one meeting when we were trying to divide who gets what, she claimed I hid the money. I told her to drop it or I would turn her life to shit, and oddly enough, she did. She became very wary of me, and I could see her carefully choosing her words so as not to upset me. I suppose that's what fear looked like. I told her that she would get a substantial income from the house when it sold, and that was the end of it. It took a while, but eventually we divorced. I bought a 3-bedroom condo so the kids could stay with me. I had them almost every weekend since Jean was back to selling houses, and weekends were her busiest period, so it was good for me. I missed them from time to time as I started traveling regularly again, especially to the Far East. But overall, life wasn't too bad. I laughed at myself. Things were bad, but not that bad. Jean's relationship with Evelyn broke down immediately after I showed her the tape of my run-in with Miller. I also circulated an edited version of the tape of her father's voice confessing everything. It was actually another thing that took on a life of its own, independent of the original intent. Evelyn left a couple months later, and I never heard from or about her again. I met Layla in Chicago. Her real name was Leanne Roxton. She had cleaned herself up and was enjoying her work. Did you know? I asked her. It was like an open secret, she confirmed. No one admitted to the abuse directly. Everyone was afraid that if they were kicked out on the street, it would be worse. Why didn't you tell me about it too? I asked, wondering. She laughed and shook her head. I had no idea, she admitted. Well, for one thing, I wasn't abused or anything like that. I contacted a few women I know and asked them if they'd be willing to say they were abused, and I'd give them $5,000. She glared at me, daring me to object to her mercantile actions. But I had no time to talk. The second woman with whom I was still in touch was Rita French. On the phone, she fell apart and disconnected from me. But when I called the radio station a few days later, when Miller's daughter went on the air, as you heard, the first one was Rita. Apparently, she decided she'd held on to him long enough. She sipped her soda. I didn't even have to pay her. I called her after the radio show, and she said she only vaguely remembered one of the others. But before she could even try to contact her, the Me Too campaign started organically, and once it started, the whole thing just took off with us. You could have made so much money. I sympathized. She shook her head sadly. By the time they sued Miller, I was in Chicago and honestly had no idea what was going on. When I looked again, it was already over. She smiled slightly, remembering what could have been. But you gave me a good start, Adam. Thank you. Well, that was it. My revenge was complete, and against all odds, my actions were justified. It was more than I had expected. I kept telling myself I wasn't a monster, but was I? The Millers were destroyed, just like in a fictional saga. I learned lessons in revenge and executed them in ways I never dreamed possible. Financially, things were looking up for me. The business was growing, and George was starting to talk about me buying him out so he could retire. Dean and Kathy adjusted to life the way teenagers do. Their focus was on school, friends, and sports. Mom and Dad had already moved into the background, becoming handy ATMs and chauffeurs. Life went on as usual. About 4 years after the divorce, Jean began dating an older man. For a while, they lived together. After a few years of living together, they were married. Dean and Kathy said he was a nice guy. I was single and had no fantasy, which meant I wasn't seriously dating anyone. I guess I still had trust issues. After a long time, at my father's insistence, I started seeing a trauma counselor and began the process of improving my attitude and life in general, but I still have a long way to go. The end. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.